Evening and welcome. It's 5:30, so we'll go ahead and get started. I am Megan Rust, Interpretation Director at the Frist Art Museum. Thank you for joining us for this evening's lecture, Albrecht Dürer, Renaissance Art and the Transformation of the Bible, presented by David H. Price. We will begin with a land acknowledgement. The Frist Art Museum's building sits on land that Cherokee and Shawnee Native peoples and elders call their homeland. We acknowledge and pay respect to them. We also acknowledge and offer deep gratitude to the ancestral land and water that support us. This evening's lecture is presented in conjunction with the exhibition Albrecht Dürer, The Age of Reformation and Renaissance. The exhibition is organized by the Cincinnati Art Museum and will be on view in the Frist upper level galleries through February 7th, 2021. The Frist Art Museum would like to thank curator Trinita Kennedy for overseeing our presentation of this exhibition. And we gratefully acknowledge our supporting sponsors, the Ann and Joe Russell family. We'd also like to thank Metro Nashville Arts Commission, the Tennessee Arts Commission, and the National Endowment for the Arts for their continued operating support. Before we begin, I'd like to share a few reminders. At the end of the presentation today, we'll take questions from the audience. Please submit your questions anytime throughout the presentation this evening via the Q&A feature. You'll see that at the bottom of your screen. And thank you in advance for your patience with us as we present this program online. In the event of a technical difficulty, we'll work quickly to resolve the issue. If you're having technical difficulties on your personal device, please use the chat feature to send a message to Frist IT. Now it's my pleasure to introduce David Price. Dr. Price is a leading expert on Albrecht Dürer. He has written widely on the history of early modern Europe, in particular on Renaissance visual art, the history of the Bible, and Christian-Jewish relations. He is the author of nearly 100 articles and books, including Albrecht Dürer's Renaissance, Humanism, Reformation, and the Art of Faith. And most recently, In the Beginning Was the Image, Art and the Reformation Bible. Please join me in welcoming David Price.
Hi, thank you. I'm going to share the screen with everyone and see if I can get this to work. Huh. I lost it. Completely lost it. Oh.
Where are you?
I don't know. Oh, there we go. This right here. I have to get to the front of it. Oh, thank you. Hi, sorry about that. Is everything okay? Am I in contact? I want to start by thanking all of you for coming to this Zoom lecture. When I agreed to do it, I thought that Zoom days might end before January 28th came, but alas, they haven't. But that makes me especially grateful to all of you for coming today. I also want to thank, obviously, the Frist Museum for this invitation, and especially Megan Rust, who has guided me through this lecture, and I'm very grateful to all of her support. I'd also like to thank I think it's appropriate that we thank the Cincinnati Art Museum for loaning us this selection of Durer prints from their really amazing collection. And I have a special reason to thank the Cincinnati Art Museum. I went to high school in Cincinnati, And for sure, the most inspiring course I had was art history. And that course brought my classmates and me to the Cincinnati Art Museum pretty regularly. And it really, as I say, it was very inspiring. And it really launched my career in some ways because it made me appreciate just how exciting it was to study history from the perspective of visual art. So I'm very grateful to Cincinnati Art Museum. Now, the focus of the Frist exhibition on Albrecht Dürer and the age of Reformation and Renaissance goes right to the heart of Dürer's accomplishment. He's widely acknowledged as the initiator of the Northern Renaissance style. And his generation also shaped the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. Dürer's circle in Nuremberg was even responsible for the first translation of Luther's 95 Theses into German. Our specific focus today on Renaissance art and the transformation of the Bible will enable us to combine the two focuses of the Frist exhibition. By considering the rapid transformations of the Bible in this period, we'll see the ways that Renaissance and Reformation intersected, especially for Dürer. Before we look at Dürer's art, I'd like to define three Bibles that will play a role for us this evening. First, the Vulgate Bible. This is the translation by Saint Jerome, started in 380s. And it was the book that dominated European culture for over 1,000 years. In the aftermath of Jerome's translations, theologians in the West no longer consulted Hebrew and Greek sources for the Bible. And once Johannes Gutenberg invented printing with movable type, he immediately printed the Latin Vulgate by Saint Jerome, 1453. The second Bible is Erasmus's New Testament in Greek from 1516. This is the first printed edition of the Christian Bible in its original Greek. As a challenge to the Vulgate and to scholastic theology, it was extremely controversial, but it definitively launched a new orientation to biblicism across Europe. Students often ask me, why is this so important, this Greek edition, this first Greek edition of the Bible? The answer is simple. The different versions of the Bible say different things. For example, the Vulgate Latin says, do penance, the sacrament of penance, implying that you need to do something to earn reconciliation, while the original Greek just says, repent, change your outlook. Luther used that distinction in the 95 Theses to reject the theology of indulgences. And in general, this new version gave credibility to efforts to challenge many aspects of medieval theology. Luther's Bible, our third work is Luther's Bible, the New Testament of 1522. This is the first vernacular rendering of the Greek New Testament. Luther could claim that this Bible for the common people was more reliable than the Latin Bible of scholars. Its literary brilliance is also universally recognized. I would say that it's important to know that Luther didn't do this by himself. He collaborated with quite a few colleagues at Wittenberg, most importantly with Philip Melanton. We'll understand the importance of that in a few moments. Now, my first subject is promoting biblical philology and Saint Jerome. And I want to start by looking at some Bible texts that Durer published, but understanding, of course, that the artist was not a textual scholar. Durer included some fascinating snippets of Bible texts in a few of his early woodcuts. In fact, a surprising feature of these early works is their date. They were designed to promote an interest in original language Bibles before any Christian scholars had started to create projects to print Hebrew and Greek Bibles. You are looking at the earliest signed woodcut of Durer's career, a depiction of Saint Jerome from 1492. Although the image itself offers an ambitious and entertaining array of diverse focuses. Of course, the lion, the scholar's books, the exotic alphabets, the nice cityscape in the background, which perhaps is intended to show a connection between the reclusive world of the scholar and the general world. So it is certainly an appealing woodcut, but this design is by an artist who shows no indication of having seen Italian Renaissance art. There's no discernible interest in human anatomy, not even awareness that bodies have volume or weight, nor is space represented rationally. Linear perspective, although invented in Florence at least 70 years before this, is simply unknown to this artist and also to all other artists in Northern Europe at this time. Yet this print is avant-garde in its biblical philology. Durer's modest woodcut actually achieves a xylographic printing of a text of the Bible in the three holy languages, Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. Although not in letterpress and limited to the first verse and a half of Genesis, this still qualifies as the first ever polyglot imprint of a Bible text. As far as I can determine, this is the earliest printing of the beginning of Genesis according to the Septuagint Bible, so the one far left there. The woodcut of 1492 is also a very early case of a Christian trying to print a Hebrew text. It's impressive that Dürer took the trouble to write Hebrew characters. For Christian artists, nearly always resorted to pseudo-Hebrew lettering when a work of art needed to suggest the Hebrew Bible, as for example, Moses with the two tablets. From the perspective of scholarship, however, expectations were just then starting to rise. Jewish publishers had printed 2 Hebrew Bibles by this date, and before long, in 1506, the first Hebrew grammar and lexicon for Christians was printed. An interesting feature of that pioneering Christian work is that it recorded nearly 300 errors in the Vulgate and asserted for the first time ever the absolute necessity of returning to the original Hebrew for Christian Old Testament research. Dürer's workshop incorporated biblical Hebrew into a few more compositions from this period. Around 1501, he designed this Italianate bookplate, replete with Renaissance garlands and very lively putti scattered throughout. This is for his closest friend, the humanist scholar Willibald Pirkheimer. This time, Dürer achieves a much more convincing display of humanist philology. The text of Psalms 111, line 10, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom," is printed in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin without error. His workshop also produced this remarkable woodcut indulgence, a broadside with instructions for reciting, quote, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews," in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. According to the instructions in this broadside, whoever does this will receive remission from time in purgatory. And very helpfully at the top of the broadside, the designer has transliterated the Hebrew and Greek into German letters. Dürer's workshop also created this woodcut of Fortuna, a decidedly secular image, but adorned with scattered verses from the Song of Song. This composition really grabs me because the artist's monogram AD is printed here in Hebrew letters at the lower left. I'd like to return briefly to the subject of Saint Jerome in Dürer's art. Above all, Dürer promoted humanist biblical scholarship by publishing many images of Jerome in woodcut and engraving. He depicted the scholar more than any other saint, altogether in some 13 compositions, thereby fueling Jerome's growing popularity as the patron saint of humanists. The humanists were just then beginning to emulate his scholarship, especially his knowledge of Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic. His most famous rendering of Jerome, the masterful 1514 engraving, exemplifies Durer's strategy. He wanted the philological movement to appear compatible with traditional sources of authority. Thus, we have symbols of the Holy Spirit, the piety of the saint, and also his status in the hierarchy of the church with his cardinal's hat, thereby making biblical philology just one aspect of his saintliness. And yet, Durer did emphasize the new discipline of biblical philology by representing a plant hanging from the ceiling, very dramatically distorted in the top right of this composition, as a reference to a prominent controversy over the differences among Jerome's textual sources. Specifically, this plant has to do with Saint Jerome's strong objections to Jerome's use of the Hebrew text in the translation of Jonah's Bower. I want to skip through these. I'm going to move to my next topic, Durer as Bible publisher. Durer also published 3 editions of the Book of Revelation in Saint Jerome's version, 2 in Jerome's Latin Vulgate and 1 in a German translation of the Vulgate. The Apocalypse has the distinction of being the first book ever published by a visual artist. As the colophon says, quote, printed in Nuremberg by Albrecht Dürer, the painter, in 1498. The press work was done by the Nuremberg firm of Anton Koberger, who was not only the proprietor of the largest publishing house in Europe, but also just happened to be the godfather of Albrecht Dürer. In fact, his godfather published more Bibles than any other 15th century printer, some 20 imprints of the Vulgate, including the richly illustrated German Bible of 1483, which is customarily referred to as the Koberger Bible. The Apocalypse was Durer's breakthrough work as an international artist. It brought him instant fame across Germany, Italy, and the Low Countries, so much so that it's hard to overstate the extent of Durer's influence. As one print historian put it, quote, no single artist has had as lasting an impact on the history of printmaking as Albrecht Dürer. The Apocalypse was a breakthrough specifically for the art of the woodcut. No one in Europe had, not even in Italy, had seen woodcuts as vivid and ingenious as these, remarkable for their expressiveness, action, clarity, as well as for the coherence of the large compositions. These woodcuts are 15 inches high. The Latin edition is in a way more distinctive than the German, for Durer's 1498 Latin is one of the first 2 Latin Bibles to be illustrated, whereas illustrations were standard in 15th century German Bible production. The Apocalypse exemplifies the early phase of Durer's absorption of Italian Renaissance art. As such, it marks a major advance in his ability to represent objects naturalistically, especially the human body, and in particular, his first attempts at classical contrapposto. It is, however, only a beginning for his stylistic refinements. In later works, which show a much stronger command of perspective, and after 1507, he would develop a new, more complex technique of chiaroscuro contrast for woodcuts. An excellent example of his Apocalypse style can be seen in the 7 candlesticks, with the realistic representation of John's kneeling figure and the objects around him. Erwin Panofsky observed that the visionary appearance of this work depends entirely on Durer's ability to depict objects so naturalistically while placing them in unnatural settings. In modern times, the interpretation of apocalypticism in Durer's work has occasioned unusually strong disagreement. Did Durer intend his visualizations of the apocalypse to be a manifesto for ecclesiastical or political transformation? On the one hand, a venerable lineage of scholars has contended that two of Durer's woodcuts adapted the Bible into a medium for assailing corruption in the contemporary church, especially the presumed corruption of the Pope. Thus, the violent demise of the Pope in these two woodcuts expresses a proto-reformational or heretical association of the Antichrist with the papal church. Nonetheless, many other scholars have doubted that Dürer expressed or encoded a revolutionary or heretical ecclesiology in this book. In favor of the anti-papal interpretation, it is important, though, to mention that the Renaissance popes had certainly stirred extreme discontent and hostility for many vexing reasons, including their military political adventurism. Yet Dürer actually did not associate the papacy with any of the Antichrist allusions in Revelation, as would happen later in the Luther Bibles. If some images imply criticism of the papacy, perhaps it is because they represent a pope as being a powerful authority who is violently slain, but that fate also strikes the emperor and all other figures of power, as well as the poor and dispossessed. Moreover, the woodcuts in the Coburger Bible, Dürer's thematic source, also portray the same social and political level. The influence of the apocalypse on style was immense and immediate, but a major part of its reception occurred later among Protestant Bible designers. Dürer's apocalypse became the model for the very first Luther Bible, Cranach's publication of the New Testament in 1522. But Cranach and Workshop adapted Dürer's designs to extract a much stronger anti-papal message from the Bible. He removed the two popes from Dürer's vivid scenes of widespread destruction and instead inserted papal crowns as symbols of the papacy in three scenes, two on the beasts from the bottomless pit and one on the woman of Babylon, the most famous one. So we see that the papacy has shifted from passive victim in Dürer to active perpetrator in Cranach Luther. And this polemical style would establish a defining precedent for future Lutheran Bible productions, which would show little restraint in their attacks on the Catholic Church. I'd like us to move on to a very important subject. This is an unusual but significant type of Renaissance Bible, the paraphrase or recasting of the Bible to make it conform to classical conventions. The literary paraphrase of the Bible arose in antiquity from a keen desire to compensate for the simple, often rough language of scriptures. In the Renaissance, the greatest proponent of the classical paraphrase was Erasmus, who in 1517 to 1524 produced classicizing versions of all books of the New Testament. This genre may sound odd to us. Who needs a Bible rewritten in the style of Ciceronian rhetoric? But whatever we may think, Erasmus's paraphrases belong to his most successful works. For example, royal injunctions from Edward VI and Elizabeth I mandated that the English translation of his paraphrases be set up in every English church for public access. Dürer himself would publish and illustrate the gospel accounts of the Passion in two separate classical versions written by the poet Benedict Celadonius, one in the dactylic hexameter of Virgil's epic, the Aeneid, and the other in 20 different classical metrical schemes modeled on Horace's odes. These books are called the Large Passion and the Small Passion, respectively. You will see them on display in the exhibition as framed individual woodcuts, but they were all taken from books with facing page humanist biblical poetry. We are now looking at the title page of Erasmus's paraphrase of John's Gospel. Queen Mary, by the way, was the translator of this paraphrase into English. This title page, a work of Hans Holbein the Younger, is a good way to start thinking about the composite culture of Renaissance artists and writers. As you can see, the pictures do not represent John's Gospel or the Bible at all, but rather we're seeing the suicide of Cleopatra at the base, and on both sides, Dionysius of Syracuse is looting art from temples. Amazingly, we'll see the same phenomenon if we turn to the very first printings of the Christian New Testament in Greek. Not one of the illustrations in the 5 editions of Erasmus, in the 5 editions that Erasmus saw through press, represents any aspect of the Bible. This illustration is from the first edition of 1516, the beginning of Matthew in Greek. This page, the dedication to Pope Leo X from the second edition, shows an ancient battle between Romans and Germanic tribes at the top and a story about the ancient painter Apelles at the base. Another motif, this one on the 1522 New Testament title page, is a pseudo-Socratic moral dialogue called The Painting of Sebes, a work that explains how the life of virtue is the path to ultimate blessedness. Certainly a worthy subject, but it is a pagan philosophical tract with no connection to Christianity. My best sense of how we might understand this is that Erasmus is construing the Bible as part of a broad classical discourse that extends beyond Christianity, even if, in his mind, Christian revelation remains the ultimate truth. In a tribute to Johannes Reuchlin, the founder of Christian and Hebrew studies, Erasmus wrote, quote, I put this on the slide for you, "Sacred scripture is, of course, the basic authority for everything, yet I sometimes run across ancient sayings or pagan writings, even poets, so purely and reverently and admirably expressed that I cannot help believing the author's hearts were moved by some divine power. And perhaps the Spirit of Christ is more widespread than we understand, and the company of the saints includes many who are not on our calendar," end quote. In 1510, as he was drafting the first versions of his art manuals, Durer asserted that the integration of classical antiquity should be the fundamental aspiration for all Christian artists. Quote, I've got this a little long, so I put it on a slide for you. "As they used the most beautiful human proportions for their idol Apollo, so should we use those same proportions for Christ the Lord, the most beautiful in the world. And as they used Venus to express the most sublime beauty, we should depict the same elegant and refined figure of the purest Virgin Mary, the Mother of God." When he wrote these words, his path-breaking studies of classical art and Italian Renaissance classicism had already culminated in this watershed work for the Northern Renaissance, the engraved Fall of Humanity. The 1504 image transposes a Greek ideal of beauty derived from proportional studies and from the study of Roman copies of Greek statuary onto a biblical legend of prelapsarian perfection. The cultural transfer has the important result of developing art that accommodates, even privileges, a trans-Christian reflection on the nature of humanity. Both nudes are grounded in classical sources, even if a precise source for Eve cannot be identified. Usually, Durer's Eve is compared to the Medici Venus, which is one of several works thought to be a Roman copy of Praxiteles' Aphrodite of Cnidus. Durer's final creation of a realistic female nude, achieved after several years of studying classical models, represents a major expansion of the boundaries of Christian art. As Anne-Marie Bonnet observed about this work, quote, when Dürer undertook to study the female nude on the same level as the male nude, he exceeded the boundaries of philosophical and visual conventions, and once again entered unknown territory. Dürer derived the figure of Adam from an exacting study of the Apollo Belvedere, a Roman marble copy of a bronze original. Let me go to that, sorry. Which is often attributed to the Greek sculptor Leocares. Status of this sculpture, of this extremely significant sculpture, is unfortunately ultimately uncertain. It was discovered around 1489 and was the prized possession of Pope Julius II, who moved it from his own palace to the Vatican after he was elected Pope in 1503. Dürer's resulting image of Adam is extraordinary for its capacity to evoke classical statuary. Among its several unusual mimetic achievements is the representation of Adam's skin as so uncannily hard that it suggests stone or metal as much as flesh. And you'll only be able to appreciate that in person with the wonderful Cincinnati print on display. The slides just not able to convey that. Moreover, both Adam and Eve, though set in dynamic contrappostos, look somewhat rigid, frozen in motion as if statuary, a severity that Dürer accentuates by turning their heads to full profile. The visual result is that the beholder has the experience of looking simultaneously at an image of a biblical event and at a reproduction of a work of art, a classical work of art quoted within the biblical story. Dürer subsequently makes more daring use of the Apollonian ideal. Let me get to that. Of the Apollonian ideal when he applies it to the representations of Christ, as in his magnificent resurrection woodcuts for both the small passion and the large passion. The poetry in the small passion reinforces the Apollonian substance of Christ, quoting from Chelidonius, "This day," which is Easter Sunday, "is sacred to the Lord of heaven and worthy to be consecrated to Phoebus Apollo." Many of the woodcuts in the exhibition are from these passion paraphrases that Dürer published. In this example, we see the powerful, muscular Christ as an epic hero. Perhaps we are supposed to think of the Roman epic, the Aeneid, where the Trojan hero Aeneas descends into the underworld. And if you look at the Adam on the left, while we've got this before us, it's hard to imagine that Dürer did not see Michelangelo's David. Anyway, it's almost certainly a reception of that. I want to turn to the final topic today, Dürer and the Reformation Bible. Unlike Lucas Cranach and Hans Holbein the Younger, Dürer did not design a Protestant Bible imprint, although his Apocalypse, as we've seen, exerted immense influence on Protestant artists, and a couple of his earlier woodcuts were reprinted in Lutheran Bibles. Nonetheless, he did create two major works that promoted the transformative force of Luther's translation. One is the Four Holy Men, which I have here for you. This is his last major painting, which he designed as a monument to the authority of the Bible, especially as a bulwark against heresy and revolt. We don't have time to assess this composition, but I do want to point out that a major feature is its textuality. You can see at the base there. Its use of passages by these four Bible authors, John, Peter, Mark, and Paul, all transcribed exactly from Luther's versions, right under the feet of the evangelists. Obviously, these are more than just footnotes, as it were, but we don't have time to go through this composition. I want to concentrate on this one. The other work is Durer's Last Supper of 1523, a stunning innovation in the history of Christian iconography that visualizes the message of Luther's renowned preface to the 1522 New Testament. Unlike traditional versions of the Last Supper, which portray Christ's announcement of the betrayal, this woodcut depicts Christ addressing the disciples after Judas has departed. This is evident because there are only 11 apostles present at the table. Therefore, we are looking at Christ announcing the new commandment, as recorded in John 13:34, which in my English rendering of Luther's German reads as follows, quote, "A new commandment I give you, that you love one another as I loved you. Thereby, everyone will recognize that you are my disciples, in that you have love for one another." This verse, never previously represented in art, is the proof text for Luther's concise but forceful introduction to the 1522 New Testament. Luther claimed that he wrote the preface reluctantly, but he felt it was necessary to provide a guide for reading the new Bible. In other words, he wrote the preface in order to explain how readers could extract Protestant theology from the Bible. He describes the basic Protestant differentiation between the law and the gospel, claiming that the latter, as the promise of salvation through Jesus Christ, is the only way to salvation. He urges the reader, quote, "not to seek laws and commandments where it is necessary to seek the gospel and the promises of God," end quote. And above all, Luther tries to explicate the status of good works in this theological system of justification by faith alone, apart from any works. After all, what would motivate the desire to do good if good works did not contribute to justification or lead to salvation? His solution was to reverse the cause and effect of works righteousness theology with the explanation that charity flows from the faith of the person living in Christ's redemption. For Luther, this passage depicted here, John 13:34, is the Archimedean point that allows insight into the connection between justification by faith alone and the ethic of love. Therefore, in the concluding sentences of the preface, Luther urges lay people to read scripture from the perspective of this new commandment. Quote, "That is what Christ means, for at the end, he gave no other commandment than love, by which one could recognize who were his disciples and right believers. Since wherever works and love do not come forth, faith is not right, for the gospel has not yet taken hold." What we see then is not a penitential discourse of the traditional Last Supper with its announcement of the betrayal, but rather an innovative image of Christ's formation of the evangelical community as the disciples undergo a conversion to Christ's injunction to love. I want to conclude our time by considering two final engravings in Durer's career. These are the two final engravings in his career, the portraits of Philip Melanton and Erasmus. The turbulent first decade of the Reformation, which was the final decade of Durer's life, occasioned several artistic innovations, among which was his development of a new genre, the engraved portrait. This is the complete set of his engraved portraiture. Thinking of this genre, and in his enthusiasm for the nascent Lutheran movement, Durer wrote in 1520, quote, "God help me that I may go to Dr. Martin Luther. Thus I intend to make a portrait of him with great care and engrave him on a copper plate to create a lasting memorial of the Christian man who helped me overcome so many anxieties." End quote. Durer was never to make a portrait of Luther, but the portraits he did engrave include in each case important figures in the early history of the Reformation: Albrecht of Brandenburg, Frederick the Wise, Willibald Pirkheimer, Philip Melanton, and Desiderius Erasmus. The common denominator among these subjects is humanism. They are all either leading humanist scholars or major patrons of humanist studies. Dürer's last engravings, Melanton and Erasmus, represent the two most significant New Testament scholars from the 1520s, the most important figures for the new grounding of a Christian Bible in the original Greek. Melanton was professor of Greek at the University of Wittenberg. He not only taught Luther Greek so that Luther could read Erasmus's Bible, but he was also his most important collaborator on the Bible translations and all else, it seems. It was Melanton, not Luther, who wrote the first Protestant systematic theology. It was Melanton, not Luther, who wrote the definitive Augsburg Confession. And after Luther's death, Melanton would be the recognized leader of the movement. In a way, the Melanton portrait is a selective composite of Lucas Cranach's Luther images. Above all, Dürer recalls Cranach's approach in Luther as Doctor of Theology, which with its emphasis on intellectual authority. Despite Dürer's efforts, Despite Dürer's efforts to soften the severity of the full profile with a slight turn of the head to the right, the exaggerated bone structure of the brow still portrays intellectual force. Melanton's intellect is also the theme of the epigram, which, like Cranach's engraving, includes a tribute to the artist as well as the subject. Quote, Dürer was able to depict the face of the living Philip. His learned hand was not able to depict his mind, end quote. The occasion for the portrait is of enormous relevance. After the initial legal implementation of the Reformation in 1525, the first major initiative the city of Nuremberg undertook was the founding of a new school, the elite Nuremberg Academy for Advanced Education in the Humanities. It was established in the St. Giles Monastery, prime real estate that was suddenly in need of a new purpose since the monastic orders had just been dissolved. Melanton developed the school's curriculum, and he delivered the inaugural address for the academy on the 23rd of May, 1526. That's the occasion for this portrait. The theme of Melanton's inaugural oration, which was the significance of the humanities as the foundation for political and ecclesiastical life, will probably sound a little bit quaint to us today. Quote, "For what brings greater usefulness to the whole human race than the humanities and their study? Unless you preserve the humanities, religion and law cannot endure. No bulwark or city walls are stronger than citizens endowed with learning, prudence, and other virtues," end quote. A most curious feature of the speech, given the extreme political turmoil, is that Melanton does not once mention Luther, Wittenberg, or the Reformation, but instead includes as his climactic peroration a warm tribute to the rebirth of Greek philology, which he claims decisively stabilized biblical knowledge. Quote, "The recovery of Greek has purified religion, which had been cast aside and repressed," end quote. The very last engraving of Dürer's long and distinguished career portrays Erasmus. This is a composition that historians have frequently viewed as a conundrum. Why did Dürer delay execution of this engraving 5 years after he made preparatory drawings in Brussels? Moreover, during that interval, Erasmus and Luther engaged in a bitter exchange of published books and pamphlets over the issue of free will. Luther contended that humanity had no free will to act independently of God in matters pertaining to salvation, whereas Erasmus allowed for the efficacy of human moral effort. If Dürer was a supporter of Luther, why did he promote Erasmus with this spectacular publication in 1526? The engraving subtly suggests connections between Erasmus and Saint Jerome. I should start by saying that what Erasmus is writing a letter at his desk in the composition. Both Erasmus and Saint Jerome were renowned not only as Bible scholars, but also as letter writers. In this respect, it is good to remember that the Vulgate Bible does not begin with Genesis, but rather with one of Jerome's letters as the standard beginning. For his part, Erasmus had long been the most sought after correspondent of the era. In addition to publishing his own correspondence, Erasmus himself produced a separate edition of Jerome's letters in 1512, and he once claimed that he had copied out all of Jerome's letters by hand as a sign of his great reverence for the biblical scholar. The epistolary attribute was so significant that Durer included prominent letter racks in his Jerome compositions, including the 1514 engraving that we looked at earlier. Durer's portrait of Erasmus also recalls the 1514 Jerome insofar as both are representations of the study, although in the case of Erasmus, with an even stronger emphasis on the intellectual accomplishments of the study. This is achieved by the dramatic foreshortening of the books in the foreground with the open folio leading our eyes across the desktop to the inscribed tablet, which is an unusual focal point for the perspective. Let's not get to this. The result is as much a still life of books in a study as the portrait of a scholar. A major part of the composition is the tablet. I should go back to that. Written in Latin and Greek. And it says, the image of Erasmus of Rotterdam, delineated from a life sketch by Albrecht Dürer. The writings will show him better. And end of the tablet inscription. The motto goes right to the heart of Dürer's engraving, and more importantly, right to the heart of Erasmus's Bible, where Erasmus promotes Jesus's ethical teachings, which he calls the Philosophia Christi, the philosophy of Christ, as an alternative to the cult of the saints and to the complex speculative philosophies of the scholastics. In the conclusion to the introduction to the New Greek Bible, Erasmus writes the following. These writings bring Christ to us so much more effectively than any paltry image. The latter represents only the form of the body, if indeed it represents anything of him. But these writings, in other words, the Bible, bring you the living image of his holy mind and the speaking, healing, dying, rising of Christ himself. And thus they render him so fully present that you would see less if you gazed upon him with your very eyes. Erasmus hoped that the moral teachings of Christ would be the basis for a broad reform of the church, encompassing both the laity and hierarchy. In other passages in the preface, he describes the Gospels as the ideal basis for enriching vernacular culture. People of all stations in life should sing songs based on the Gospel, pass their time recounting stories from the Bible. In an especially provocative statement, Erasmus says, quote, everyone can be a theologian, meaning that there is no need for mediation of the Bible. In other words, that the scholastic theological systems are unwarranted. This is all fine and good, but we have to remember that Erasmus promoted this ideal for a biblical culture for all social classes within the covers of a Greek Bible that only a few experts could hope to fathom. And of course, It was only when Luther translated Erasmus's Greek Bible so brilliantly that the Humanist Bible was transformed into a basis for Christian culture. We won't be able to solve every facet of the conundrum of the Dürer-Erasmus-Luther triangle, certainly not to every scholar's satisfaction. I'm suggesting that Dürer perceived and strongly supported the Lutheran movement from the perspective of biblicism, which enabled him to appreciate the important commonalities between Erasmus and Luther. Above all, in his effort to promote both Renaissance humanism and the Reformation, the artist became a prolific proponent of biblical philology. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that fascinating look at Albrecht Dürer. We have a few questions already in the Q&A, but if you have any questions you'd like to ask Dr. Price, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. The first question, which I think you touched on slightly, but would love for you to elaborate on. Someone asked, Dürer seems to have a great understanding of classical culture as well as biblical studies. Was he well educated, or did his humanist friends help guide his themes?
That's a really great question. So his formal education was fairly limited, and he was not able to write Latin. So he's very important in the history of art and also the history of the German language, because he wrote technical manuals in German. And those manuals then were translated by some of his friends into Latin. So, and he certainly felt that as he felt that as really a kind of liability, that he wasn't fully a humanist in his ability to use Latin at any event. Beyond that, what I say might sound a little bit controversial. I'm pretty sure that he could understand basic Latin fairly easily, and that he was certainly well read in the classics. He owned a Latin translation of Euclid's Geometry, for example, and other works as well. And he acquired great knowledge of classics and of contemporary culture, mainly through participation in a formal club in Nuremberg, which was a group of the absolute cultural elites. And this group was very proud to have the most famous German artist as one of its members. So he would have been supported by others, but it's really interesting. People like Erasmus or Pirkheimer, they see Dürer as a fellow humanist. But as I say, he could not write sophisticated Latin for sure. And that would disqualify him from being a full Renaissance humanist, as it were.
Irma asks, was the 95 Theses written in Latin originally?
Yeah, the 95 Theses was published in a broadside, all on one side, in Latin. And it was mailed off to Nuremberg right away. Nuremberg had excellent connections with Wittenberg. And the Nuremberg Circle immediately translated into German and printed it and distributed it further, also sent it back to Luther with a second Latin printing of the 95 Theses. The 95 Theses touched off an immediate explosion. And it's interesting, when Luther received the German translation of the 95 Theses and this new Latin edition of it from Nuremberg, and he wrote a thank you note back to Nuremberg about it, and he implies that he understands that Albrecht Dürer was associated with this group that translated the theses. He doesn't quite say Dürer was amongst you, but he says, thanks for this. And I also particularly thank you for the Dürer material that was sent to me. And that is really what touched off, of course, the Reformation, we all know that, but it had to be translated into German, it had to be reprinted. It was reprinted immediately in several centers of Germany and distributed all over the empire.
So many good questions. On that thread, someone asks, as he started to create more works with humanist ideas, did his relationship with the church fracture, or were humanists in good standing with the church?
That's a great question too. So humanism, when humanism begins in the German Empire, pretty much in the 1490s, there's no sense that the church would ever fracture. But the humanists are interested in reforming the church and supporting reform of the church in various kinds of ways. Once we do get the Protestant Reformation, once the church is fractured, as it were, then you have humanists in both camps. So you have Catholic humanists and Protestant humanists, and you have all kinds of different varieties of Protestant humanists. It is interesting that intellectually these humanists, even though they end up Catholic or Protestant, are still part of a kind of a intellectual culture. So Erasmus remains Catholic, but communicates very much with Protestants about humanist issues, including church reform, including with Melanton. And Erasmus had a great deal of respect for Melanton. Melanton was known throughout Europe as the premier German humanist. And he was a more appealing figure to most Europeans than was Luther. And it's almost more effective for Dürer to use Melanton as a humanist image of the Protestant Reformation rather than Luther, because Luther was just so much more controversial than Melanton, even though at the end of the day, Melanton is theologically very Lutheran. It's just that he had this prestige as a humanist. So Dürer, it wasn't his interest in humanism that was the cause of Dürer leaving the Catholic Church. It really was his own. It was really his own conviction, and also, this is very important. Also, Catholicism was illegal in his hometown as of 1525. There's still, of course, some toleration for a while. And it was illegal, by the way, when Dürer made the portrait of Melanton, it was illegal it was also illegal to make propaganda supporting Luther because people were afraid of the disruptions caused by his propaganda. Everyone ignored those restrictions. But it was Luther that led to Dürer's break with the church. The thing you have to remember is that Leo X, the Pope when the Reformation broke out, Medici Pope, was one of the strongest supporters of humanism even against scholastics. Erasmus dedicated the New Testament to Pope Leo X. So the Pope really was a major source of support for humanism, as was Albrecht of Brandenburg, another figure who is one of the causes for the outbreak of the Protestant Reformation.
Naomi asks, is there a way to view the various illustrated Bibles you've displayed tonight online? Do you know of any sources you can share?
Yeah, if you have the exact even if you just enter a Google search with the exact bibliographic information, there's a good chance you'll get a hit for a facsimile. If you have trouble, feel free to write to me, email, and I'll help you get them. But with any luck, you would find them very quickly. I use a portal in Germany and it works really well for advanced searching for digital versions. Sometimes I just do a Google search and up pops a digitized version of one of these Bibles. But you need to give fairly exact information. Bible's always hard to search because there are just so many Bibles. So you have to be precise when you enter the search. And all the Bibles I mentioned are available in multiple digital copies. That's one of the great things about the digital revolution, is it just makes everyone's research so much easier.
Well, we have so many questions. I'm sorry we won't have time to get to all of them, but I think we have time for one more. I think this one would be interesting to hear about. Yvonne asks, Durer seems to use very playful and interesting inclusions of his signatures within the artwork. May I ask you to discuss this feature?
Yes, it's a great question. What we're looking at here, are we seeing the Erasmus portrait, everyone?
Mm-hmm.
So what we're seeing here is his trademark, the monogram, and he protected his trademark, and he got copyrights for his publications from the emperor. He was just so prestigious, he was able to do that. And people did copy his stuff, and he, in one case, tried to prosecute someone for copying his stuff. So this is his main signature, the one you're looking at, the AD. And there are others. Probably that Hebrew one is amazing. It's not well studied because it's in a print that's considered Dürer school, not Dürer himself. So it's generated almost no research, that image. But probably the most interesting, one of the most interesting signatures for Dürer is on the 1504 Fall of Humanity, the Adam and Eve that we talked about, the engraving. And in that one, he signs it as Albertus Dureros Noricus. Albertus Dureros Noricus, and it just says Faciebat. And that so it's Albrecht Dürer of Nuremberg. The Noricus refers to Nuremberg. And what he's doing there is he's giving himself a Roman identity using this tripartite Roman nomenclature, like Publius Virgilius Maro. We just say Virgil, but his real name is, they're always tripartite. Publius Virgilius Maro. Gaius Valerius Catullus, for the great poet Catullus. So that's the only time he did it. In that extraordinarily classical composition, he tries to adopt an artistic identity as a Roman, as it were.
Very interesting. Well, thank you again. And thank you all so much for attending this evening. We invite you to see the exhibition Albrecht Dürer, The Age of Reformation and Renaissance at the Frist Art Museum. As I mentioned, we've got about a week left. It closes on February 7th, and you can reserve your time tickets to see these works in person at fristartmuseum.org. We hope to see you in person soon or virtually at our next program online. You can find out more about our upcoming virtual programs by visiting our website, following us on social media, or by signing up for our weekly email newsletter. As you leave the Zoom tonight, you'll be invited to take a brief survey. A link to the survey will appear in your browser, or you'll get a thank you email tomorrow with a link. Your feedback is important to us, and it will help us improve future programs. Finally, thank you so much for your support of the Frist Art Museum. Financial gifts during this time allow us to bring you great programming like tonight's lecture. Support of any amount is greatly appreciated. Please consider making a donation at fristartmuseum.org. Thanks again. Thank you, Dr. Price, and hope you all have a great evening.